Right after my dad's funeral, my mom married her lover, smirking, "I've waited long enough." But when the priest pulled out another will, my stepfather's face went white, and mom nearly fainted at the truth. I never thought I'd see something more painful than my father's slow death. The months leading up to his passing had been a nightmare of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and watching a strong man waste away to nothing. Dad had been the kind of person who filled every room he entered. His laugh was infectious, his presence commanding yet warm. He had built his construction business from the ground up, working 16-hour days in his 20s and 30s, his hands permanently stained with concrete dust and engine oil. I remember him teaching me how to use tools when I was barely tall enough to reach his workbench. "Measure twice, cut once, mija," he'd say, his large hands guiding mine as we worked on some project in the garage. He believed in doing things right the first time, in keeping your word, in taking care of your family above all else. But cancer doesn't care about character. It strips away everything: dignity, strength, hope. In those final months, I watched my father transform from a man who could lift concrete blocks with ease to someone who struggled to hold a coffee cup steady. The treatments left him gaunt and hollow-eyed, his thick black hair falling out in clumps until he finally asked Carmen to shave it all off. "At least this way I look tough instead of sick," he joked, running his hand over his bald scalp. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the way he'd stare at his reflection when he thought no one was looking. Throughout it all, Mom had played the part of the devoted wife perfectly. She'd accompany him to every appointment, hold his hand during the worst of the nausea, speak in hushed, concerned tones with the doctors. To anyone watching, Elena Moreno was a woman devoted to her dying husband. But I knew better. We all did. The late-night phone calls had started even before Dad's diagnosis. At first, they were infrequent, a quick conversation taken in the kitchen while Dad watched television, Mom's voice dropping to a whisper as she turned away from us. When we asked, she'd wave us off with excuses about work, about clients who could only talk after hours. Then came the mysterious errands. "I need to run to the office," she'd say, even on weekends. "The Peterson project needs attention." Or, "I'm meeting with a supplier about the Martinez job." Always something urgent, always something that couldn't wait. Dad never said anything, but I caught him watching her sometimes. There was a sadness in his eyes that had nothing to do with his illness. He'd look at her when she was checking her phone, when she was getting dressed to go out, when she'd return home with that flushed, guilty look of someone who'd been somewhere they shouldn't have been. The worst part was how she'd overcompensate afterward. She'd fuss over him excessively, bringing him soup he couldn't keep down, fluffing pillows that didn't need adjusting, asking if he needed anything in that saccharine voice that made my skin crawl. It was guilt masquerading as love, and it fooled no one except maybe herself. But that was before I watched my mother walk straight from his funeral to her lover, wearing a wedding suit. I stood there, stunned, my mind barely processing what was happening. The funeral had just ended. The last handful of dirt tossed onto my father's grave. People were still lingering, murmuring condolences, wiping their eyes. My sister Carmen was clutching a crumpled tissue, her shoulders shaking. My younger brother Diego had been silent the whole day, his face tight with a kind of grief that can't be spoken aloud. And my mother, she didn't even pretend to be mourning. I had been watching her throughout the service, waiting for some sign of sorrow, some crack in her usual self-centered facade. Instead, she had spent most of the ceremony looking at her watch. Not at my father's casket, not at his portrait resting on the easel beside the flowers. Just her damn watch. I should have known something was coming. But even then, I could never have imagined this. As soon as the last prayer was said and the crowd started to thin, she turned on her heel and walked away. Not toward us, not toward my father's grave, but toward him. A man standing near the trees, just beyond the cemetery path. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even wearing the usual funeral black. He had a coat on, buttoned up against the chilly New York wind. But beneath it, I caught a glimpse of something unmistakable, a crisp white shirt and tie. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. Carmen stiffened beside me. "Is that," Diego let out a low curse. "That's Marcus." Marcus. The man we had all known about, but never openly acknowledged. Our mother's lover. He had been in the background of our lives for 2 years. A shadow lurking just beyond our father's presence. Marcus Rivera, tall, dark-haired, with a kind of easy smile that probably charmed women half his age. He worked in commercial real estate, always dressed in expensive suits, always driving the latest model luxury car. I'd first met him at one of Mom's business networking events 2 years ago, about 6 months after Dad was first diagnosed. "This is Marcus," Mom had said, her hand lingering on his arm just a moment too long. "He's helping us with some property acquisitions for the business." Dad had built his construction company from nothing, but Mom had always handled the business development side, finding new clients, managing relationships, identifying investment opportunities. It made sense that she'd be networking with someone in commercial real estate, but even then, something about their interaction had felt off. The way they looked at each other, the private jokes, the subtle touches that lasted just a heartbeat longer than professional courtesy required. Even then, something about their interaction had felt off. The way they looked at each other, the private jokes, the subtle touches that lasted just a heartbeat longer than professional courtesy required. Dad had been across the room, talking animatedly with potential clients, completely oblivious to what was happening right under his nose. The whispers started after that. Late-night phone calls she took in the other room, her voice dropping to an intimate murmur as soon as she thought we were out of earshot. "No, I can't tonight," I'd overheard her saying once. "Antonio's having a bad day." The way she said Dad's name, like an inconvenience, an obstacle to be navigated rather than her husband of 3 decades. There were the mysterious business dinners that ran impossibly late, the weekend client meetings that never seemed to result in any new contracts. Her behavior became erratic. One moment she'd be snapping at Dad over trivial things, the next she'd be overwhelmed with guilt-driven affection, buying him expensive gifts we all knew he didn't want. The breaking point came about 18 months into Dad's treatment. Carmen had stopped by unexpectedly to drop off groceries and found Mom getting ready to go out, full makeup, a dress that cost more than most people's rent, jewelry that sparkled under the kitchen lights. "Where are you going?" Carmen had asked. "Business dinner," Mom replied, not meeting her eyes. "With who?" "Marcus Rivera. We're discussing the Thompson development." But Carmen had seen the Thompson development plans on Dad's desk that morning. The project had been canceled weeks earlier due to zoning issues. She'd called Diego and me immediately. That night, we followed her. It wasn't our proudest moment, but desperation makes you do things you never thought you would. We watched from Diego's car as she met Marcus at Castellano, the most expensive Italian restaurant in the city. Through the window, we could see them holding hands across the table, her head thrown back in laughter at something he'd said. When she came home that night, Dad was asleep in his recliner, an untouched dinner tray on the table beside him. She kissed his forehead gently, and I watched her face in the dim light. There was no guilt there, no shame. Only satisfaction. We had confronted her the next day, all 3 of us together. She denied everything, of course. "Marcus is just a business contact," she'd insisted, her voice rising in manufactured outrage. "How dare you follow me like some kind of criminals? Your father is sick, and instead of supporting your family, you're creating drama where none exists." But Dad had known. I could see it in the way he looked at her after that, the quiet resignation that settled over him like a shroud. He never said anything directly, but sometimes I'd catch him staring at old photos of them together, his fingers tracing her face with a sadness that went deeper than his physical pain. We all had known. And now, standing in front of us was the proof we had been trying so hard not to see. My mother reached Marcus, and without a shred of hesitation, she took his hand, kissed him. Right there, in the cemetery. I heard Carmen's sharp intake of breath. I saw Diego's hands curl into fists. The few remaining funeral guests had stopped in their tracks, turning toward the scene unfolding before them, their faces twisting in shock. Then my mother, standing beside the man who had destroyed our father, turned back toward us, and she smiled. It was a small, satisfied thing. The kind of smile you give when you finally get what you've been waiting for. And then she spoke. "I've waited long enough." The words sent an electric shock through my body. Waited long enough? Waited long enough for what? Marcus's hand curled around her arm, and she turned to the small cluster of remaining mourners. "Marcus and I are getting married today." A slow, thick silence spread over the cemetery. I heard someone gasp. A quiet, horrified whisper. Carmen swayed beside me, like the words had physically knocked the air from her lungs. Diego took a step forward, but I grabbed his arm. He was shaking. I could barely process what I had just heard. I forced my mouth to work. "What did you just say?" Marcus's smile widened. "We're getting married today. We already booked the church." I stared at my mother, waiting for her to contradict him, to say something, anything. But she just nodded. I felt my stomach turn to ice. The church. The same church where we had just buried our father. I looked into her face, searching for some sign that she understood what she was doing. Some flicker of shame. But there was nothing. Just an infuriating sense of relief. Like she had been waiting for this moment for years. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She had been waiting. All those months of Dad's illness, all those nights she'd sat by his bedside holding his hand, all those tears she'd shed in front of the doctors, it had all been an act. She hadn't been mourning the loss of her husband, she'd been counting down the days until she could be free of him. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Dad, just 2 days before he died. He'd been heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness, but in one of his lucid moments, He grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Take care of your brother and sister," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "And don't let her destroy what we built." At the time, I thought he was talking about the business, about the legacy he was leaving behind. Now I understood he'd been talking about something much deeper, about truth, about justice, about making sure his children knew they were loved even when their mother had forgotten how to love anyone but herself. The funeral had been a performance worthy of an Oscar. Mom had sobbed dramatically at the graveside, her shoulders shaking with what appeared to be overwhelming grief. Mourners had approached her with condolences, praising her devotion, talking about what a wonderful wife she'd been. Elena was his rock, I'd heard someone say. He was so lucky to have her. Lucky. If they only knew. But now, as she stood there announcing her wedding plans with Dad's body barely cold in the ground, the mask had finally slipped. The grieving widow act was over, and the real Elena Moreno was finally showing herself to the world. Something inside me snapped. I stepped forward. "You're seriously getting married today?" "Today?" My mother exhaled, like I was exhausting her. "It's done, Joaquina. He's gone." "He's gone?" I repeated, my voice shaking. My sister let out a sob. Diego turned away, hands on his head. "He was my husband for 30 years, my mother continued, as if we needed a reminder. "But life moves on." Life moves on. I wanted to hit her. I wanted to break something. But before I could say another word, a new voice cut through the cold air. "Actually, Elena, there's something you should see before you get married." I turned. Standing a few feet away was Father Dominic, the priest who had just performed my father's funeral. He was holding a folder, a thick, legal-looking stack of papers. My mother frowned. "What's that?" Father Dominic gave her a hard look. Then, with deliberate patience, he opened the folder and pulled out a single document. "I wasn't going to reveal this today," he said quietly. "But given your urgency, I think it's only fair." He lifted the paper and began to read, and that's when my mother's face changed. It was the first time that day I saw something other than smug satisfaction in her expression. The blood drained from her cheeks. Marcus's smirk faltered. Because the document in the priest's hands, it was a will. And not the one my mother had shown us. Not the one that left everything to her. This was another will. A secret will. A will my father had written before he died. A will that changed everything. And as the words spilled from the priest's lips, I saw the exact moment my mother realized she had just lost everything. And for the first time in my life, she looked afraid. Father Dominic's voice was steady, deliberate. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed drama, but in that moment, he held all the power. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the distant sound of a car passing on the road beyond the cemetery gates. But in that moment, the world had gone eerily still. He took a deep breath, then began to read. "I, Antonio Moreno, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke my previous will. I leave my home, my savings, and all of my assets to my children, Joaquina Moreno, Carmen Moreno, and Diego Moreno. My wife, Elena Moreno, is to receive nothing." Nothing. The words seemed to echo in the air. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I turned to my mother. Her expression had cracked. The smug confidence drained from her face, replaced by something else. Confusion, panic. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I glanced at Marcus. The color had drained from his face. He wasn't holding her arm anymore. In fact, he had taken a small step away from her. Carmen let out a choked breath. "Dad knew?" Diego exhaled, a sharp, disbelieving sound. Holy crap. I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't even name. Relief? Justice? Sadness? Maybe all of them. My mother's hands clenched into fists. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "This is a joke," she said finally, voice tight. Father Dominic held out the document. "It's not." My mother snatched it from his hands, scanning the paper. Her eyes darting frantically over the text like she could somehow will the words to change. Her lips parted, then pressed together, then parted again. Marcus peered over her shoulder. I saw his pupils shrink. I knew what he was looking for. The numbers. The money. My father had a lot of money. Not billionaire wealth, but more than most. He had worked hard for years, built savings, invested wisely. The construction business had been good to him, good enough to buy the house in Westchester, to send all 3 of his children to college without student loans, to build a comfortable retirement fund that should have lasted him and Mom for decades. But it wasn't just about the money. Dad had owned property, the family home, a small apartment building he'd bought as an investment, a piece of land upstate where he'd always planned to build a cabin for weekend getaways. There were savings accounts, retirement funds, stock portfolios that he'd managed carefully over the years. While Dad handled the construction and project management, Mom had always managed the business development and client relationships. After his diagnosis, she'd taken on more of the day-to-day operations, which is how she justified her networking events and meetings with people like Marcus. But the business, the assets, the investments, those had always been in Dad's name. I knew the numbers because Dad had shown them to me just 2 months before he died. He'd called me into his study one afternoon when Mom was out at one of her business meetings and spread the documents across his desk. "I want you to understand what's here," he'd said, his voice weak but determined. "The house is worth about $800,000 now. The apartment building brings in $60,000 a year in rental income. The investment accounts." He paused, coughing, then continued. "Close to $2 million, all told. $2 million. It was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Enough to live comfortably, to never worry about bills or retirement or unexpected expenses. Enough to make someone very, very eager for their sick spouse to die." "Why are you showing me this?" I'd asked, though part of me already knew. Dad had looked at me with those tired, knowing eyes. "Because I want you to know what you and your siblings are inheriting. All of it. Every penny." "Dad, she thinks it's hers," he'd continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "She's been planning for it, counting on it. But it's not. It never was. This money, this property, it's for you kids. It's for your future, for your children's future. It's my legacy to you, not to her." I'd stared at the documents, the implications slowly sinking in. "Does Mom know?" "She thinks she knows," Dad had replied. "She's seen the old will, the one I wrote when we first got married. Back then, everything went to the surviving spouse. That's what most couples do." He'd leaned back in his chair, exhausted by the conversation but determined to finish it. "But I changed my will 8 months ago, right? After you kids confronted her about Marcus. I knew then that she'd chosen her path." Now, standing in the cemetery watching Marcus peer over Mom's shoulder at the document that would destroy her dreams, I remembered that conversation. I remembered the pain in Dad's eyes, the betrayal he'd felt but never openly acknowledged. He'd known about Marcus, known about the affair, known that his wife was waiting for him to die so she could start her new life. My mother had always assumed it would be hers when he was gone. She had counted on it. And now it was gone. Not gone, exactly. Just not hers. My mother's breathing had changed. It had gone shallow, almost erratic. She shook her head once, twice, as if she could physically reject reality. "No," she muttered. "No. No. No. This isn't legal. This isn't real." "It is real," Father Dominic said calmly, "and it is legal. Antonio made sure of that." I saw my mother's entire world shift in that moment. I saw the exact second she understood. That will, it wasn't just about money. It was proof. Proof that my father had known what she was. That he had seen right through her. That even as he was dying, weak and frail in that hospital bed, he had been stronger than her. My mother's jaw tightened. Her face had turned an ugly shade of red. "He couldn't have done this," she said hoarsely. He wouldn't do this to me." Carmen scoffed, her voice thick with disbelief. "You mean after you cheated on him? While he was fighting cancer?" She flinched. Marcus was silent. He was still staring at the will, but his expression had changed. The panic had turned into calculation. I recognized that look. It was the look of a man weighing his options. And suddenly, I realized something. Marcus hadn't just been counting on my mother's money. He had been promised it. She had told him she was inheriting everything. I could picture the conversations they'd had, probably in expensive hotel rooms or quiet corners of restaurants where they thought no one would see them. "After Antonio's gone, we'll be set for life," she would have said, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "The house, the business, the investments, it'll all be ours." Marcus had probably done the math, calculated what $2 million could buy. A new house in the Hamptons, maybe. European vacations. The kind of lifestyle that commercial real estate commissions alone could never provide, especially not for someone whose business was built more on charm than actual success. I'd done some research on Marcus Rivera after we'd confronted Mom about the affair. His real estate firm was small, barely profitable. He drove a leased BMW, not the owned luxury car we'd all assumed. His expensive suits were probably financed, his confident swagger likely built on credit cards and borrowed time. He needed Mom's money. More than that, he'd been banking on it. The prenup conversation must have been interesting. Had Mom insisted there wouldn't be one? Had she assured him that everything Dad owned would become community property the moment they said I do? I could see it all so clearly now, the timeline they'd constructed, the future they'd planned. A respectful mourning period, maybe 6 months or a year, then a quiet wedding followed by a comfortable life funded by my father's decades of hard work. Except Dad had seen through it all. Every late-night phone call, every mysterious errand, every guilty kiss on his forehead when she returned from her rendezvous, he'd catalogued it all, and he'd planned accordingly. And now Marcus had nothing. I watched the moment he reached his decision. Marcus took another step away from her. My mother noticed. Her head snapped toward him. "Marcus," she said sharply. "This doesn't change anything. We'll fight it." He blinked once, slowly. "Fight it?" "Yes," she said quickly, desperation creeping into her voice. I have rights. I was his wife. I can contest this. This isn't over." Marcus's lips parted, like he was considering her words. Then, ever so slowly, he shook his head. "It is for me." And just like that, he turned on his heel and walked away. My mother stared after him. I don't think she had ever expected this. Not from him. Not from anyone. Marcus had been by her side for years, clinging to her like ivy on a wall. But now that she had nothing, he wasn't even looking back. Carmen let out a sound, somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. Diego muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like "damn." And me? I just watched. Because for the first time in my life, I saw fear in my mother's eyes. Real fear. Not anger. Not arrogance. Just raw, undeniable fear. Because for the first time ever, she was alone and she knew it. My mother stood frozen in place. Her face, a mess of emotions. Rage, shock, disbelief. I could practically hear her thoughts spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Marcus was gone. Her money was gone. Her home, her stability, everything she had counted on, gone. The weight of the moment was finally settling on her. And for the first time, she had no one left to manipulate. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. Then Carmen exhaled sharply. She stepped forward, shoulders squared, looking our mother dead in the eyes. "You have until the end of the week to get out of the house." Her head snapped toward Carmen, mouth parting in outrage. "The house is not yours," I cut in. "It's ours, legally. You heard the will." Her eyes darted to Diego, as if expecting our younger brother to take her side. But Diego just shook his head, jaw clenched, expression unreadable. "Don't look at me," Diego said flatly. "You did this to yourself." The lines in our mother's face deepened. She looked older, smaller somehow, like the weight of reality had finally crushed the last bit of her arrogance. I saw her lips tremble slightly, just for a second. But then, as quickly as it came, she forced herself back together. Her back straightened, her expression hardened, and she scoffed. "You think I need this house? I don't. I'll land on my feet, like I always do." None of us responded. We didn't need to. Because for the first time, we all knew the truth. She wouldn't land on her feet. Not this time. The woman who had always put herself first, who had betrayed her dying husband, who had stood at his grave planning her next wedding, she was finally getting what she deserved. And the best part? No one had to do anything. She had ruined herself. She let out a bitter chuckle, shaking her head. "You'll regret this," she muttered. But her voice lacked conviction. It was a hollow threat. One even she didn't believe. Carmen turned, already walking toward the car. Diego followed. I stood there for a moment longer, watching my mother as she realized there was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. She turned slowly, eyes scanning the cemetery, as if expecting someone to be on her side. There was no one. The mourners were gone. Marcus was gone. Even Dad's grave was silent. I walked away without another word, leaving her standing there, just another woman who had lost everything. Life moved on, but not for her. We didn't check in on her. We didn't need to. The news trickled down to us in small pieces, through old friends, distant relatives, the occasional rumor. Her downfall was slow, but it was certain. First, she tried to fight the will in court. She hired the most expensive lawyer she could find, or rather, the most expensive lawyer she could convince to take her case on contingency. Harold Pemberton, a shark in an Armani suit who specialized in contested estates. He took one look at the case and probably saw dollar signs, convinced he could find some technicality, some loophole that would overturn Dad's final wishes. The legal battle lasted 8 months. 8 months of depositions and document reviews, of character witnesses and expert testimony. Mom threw everything at it, claims that Dad wasn't of sound mind when he wrote the will, accusations that we had somehow coerced him, even suggestions that the document might be forged. But Dad had been thorough. He'd had the will witnessed by 3 independent parties, including his doctor, who testified that Antonio Moreno had been completely lucid and decisive when he'd made his final arrangements. There were video recordings of the signing, medical records proving his mental competency, even a separate letter in Dad's handwriting explaining his decision. My wife has chosen to build her future with another man, the letter read. I see no reason why she should profit from my death when she has already moved on from our marriage in every way that matters. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The will stood. Mom was ordered to pay court costs, which wiped out what little savings she had managed to keep hidden from the legal fees. Pemberton dropped her immediately after the verdict. Professional courtesy, he called it, but we all knew the truth. Without the promise of a big payout, she was just another broke client he couldn't afford to represent. Then, she tried to move in with Marcus. That conversation must have been interesting. Picture it, a desperate woman showing up at her lover's door with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of promises about a future that would never come. Marcus had strung her along for a few weeks, probably out of guilt more than genuine affection. She stayed in his one-bedroom apartment in Queens, a far cry from the Westchester home she'd shared with Dad. But reality set in quickly. Without money, without prospects, without the comfortable lifestyle she'd promised him, Elena Moreno became less of a prize and more of a burden. The breakup happened in a restaurant, according to Carmen, who heard it from a friend who'd witnessed the scene. Mom had been pleading, Marcus had been cold and final. "This isn't what I signed up for," he'd said, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "I thought you were different." Different. As if the problem was her character rather than her bank account. He blocked her number that same night. Changed the locks on his apartment. Even threatened to get a restraining order when she showed up at his office the next day, desperate and demanding explanations. She spent a few months bouncing between cheap motels, burning through whatever savings she had left. The credit cards were maxed out quickly. Turns out she'd been living beyond her means for years, probably funding her affair with Marcus on borrowed money, assuming Dad's inheritance would cover all the debts when the time came. And then, the final blow. The construction business collapsed. Dad had been the technical backbone, he knew every aspect of construction, had relationships with reliable subcontractors, understood how to bid jobs competitively while maintaining quality. But Mom had been the face of the business, the one who brought in new clients and maintained existing relationships. After his death, those relationships meant nothing. Clients had trusted Antonio Moreno's reputation for quality and reliability. They had no confidence in Elena Moreno, especially once word spread about her behavior at the funeral. The construction industry is small and tight-knit, and news travels fast. Clients walked away, bills piled up. She sold her car, then her jewelry, then whatever pride she had left. The last time I saw her, she was living in a tiny, run-down apartment in the Bronx. No expensive clothes, no fancy dinners, just a woman who had once had everything and threw it all away. She looked at me that day, standing in the doorway of her building, and I saw something I had never seen before. Not anger, not arrogance, just regret. She didn't ask me for anything. I think she already knew the answer. I turned and walked away, knowing I would never see her again. And for the first time in my life, she was finally alone with herself. As I stepped away, the cold evening air wrapped around me, crisp and clear. Behind me, the door creaked shut, sealing her inside her own ruin. For years, she had spent her life chasing more. More money, more power, more control. And now, standing in the wreckage of her own choices, she had nothing left but the silence of her own regrets. And maybe that was the cruelest punishment of all,